afternoon and welcome to this third Citizens Web Dialogue of Notre Europe Jacques Delors Institute, this time in partnership with Euractiv. Joining me this afternoon, I have the Honorary President of Notre Europe, Pascal Lamy, whose name might be better known outside of Europe than in Europe itself, at least by the political establishment of 159 countries. In fact, from 2005 to 2013, Pascal Lamy has served for 2 consecutive terms as Director General of the World Trade Organization in Geneva. He is a committed European. I've read your presentation on Notre Europe, a committed European and member of the French Socialist Party. He was, between 1985 and 1994, Chief of Cabinet of President of the European Commission at the time, Jacques Delors. He then joined the Crédit Lyonnais as CEO until 1999, and before returning to Brussels as European Trade Commissioner until 2004. So much has happened since you left Europe, pour ainsi dire, and you went to Geneva. The unresolved institutional reform in the EU after the rejection of the Constitutional Treaty and the global economic crisis has redrawn the political landscape in Europe. The sovereign debt crisis has revealed a few cracks in the very core elements of the integration of the European Union. Worries about sustainability of public finances and the lack of competitiveness shifted the attention from Central Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, to the Mediterranean countries. So ahead of the European elections this year, what are the biggest challenges facing Europe, and what are the possible future scenarios for further development of the EU at 28, and what role should Europe play in the global economy? This is why we're here today. We have received a dozen questions that I would maybe rephrase in 3 groups. I would combine them in 3 groups. One about Europe's competitiveness, of course, jobs and growth. And growth, where is it going to come from? Is it going to be trade? Is it going to actually reinforce the single market? Maybe the energy community? The institutional question, of course, more or less Europe. But what struck me before starting to answer the question of our friends that asked the question on the web, what struck me is really a word on the presentation. And that was that you were a committed Europeans. And I wonder if you can tell me, what does it mean to be a committed Europeans in 2014?
Well, I already was a reasonably committed European after the 15 years I spent in Brussels with Jacques Delors, as you said, as Chief of Staff and as European Trade Commissioner. Now, after the 8 years I spent outside Europe in the WTO as a DG, I'm even more of a committed European than when I was working in Brussels. Europe, seen from the outside of Europe, is much clearer than seen from the inside. When you're outside Europe, what you see as Europe is a specific model. The layman would call it the European way of life. Mm-hmm. If you translate this into economics, you would say a specific economic and social model, Sozialmarktwirtschaft, with environmental sensitivity, which you don't have elsewhere on this planet. So, I'm a committed European, even more than before, because my understanding of the European identity is much clearer. And I think in this world, which is globalizing full speed, with different models, economic, but mostly social models, I think the European model is worth fighting for. This is my identity. I think it is what unites the Europeans, and I think if they agree with that, it's quite easy to understand that we won't get that on our own. Given the huge elephants you have on this planet, China, US, if the Euros believe in what Europe is about, which is civilization, which is the civilized version of globalization, then they have to fight for it.
Rightly so, but it seems that actually we're not there yet. Many Europeans, and at least a considerate number, are seeing Europe actually as they're a little bit short-sighted and seeing Europe through the prism of the crisis. So we have, I would like to start with our questions that our web users decided to ask. One that got the most votes, in fact, is one by Frédéric Albert, who got 11 votes, and he says, in a previous Web Citizens dialogue, Jacques Delors analyzed the rise of populism in Europe as a consequence of a poorly managed globalization. What are now the main socio-economic advantages that we Europeans have or need to develop to promote our model of development, and especially aiming towards sustainable development?
I think what explains the current surge of populism, Euroscepticism, I mean, not all Eurosceptics are populists, not all populists are Eurosceptic, but broadly speaking, it's the same stream, is the economic and social crisis, stemming from the shock which started in the US in 07-08 and which contaminated Europe. And if you look at European history for the last, let's say, 200 years, each time there has been a political and economic and social crisis, this has created political turbulences. Sometimes revolutions, sometimes changes in governments, and that's understandable. With such, for instance, a high rate of unemployment, people are unhappy. And when they are unhappy in democracies, it shows. Now, that's the first element. Now, there is a sort of short-term, sort of crisis-generated element. Now, there is a longer issue, which is this feeling by many Europeans that European institutions are not politically legitimate enough. Now, they would understand that we have to do things together, but the way we do it, they don't feel is right, because they don't feel they have the same influence on what happens up there. And this is a very complex problem, because as long as Europeans do not share a sort of feeling of belonging to the same community, the legitimacy of European power will be weak. So it's a sort of chicken and egg. Institutions cannot be really legitimate if people don't feel this sort of common belonging, but institutions can also contribute to generate this common belonging, which, in my view, is the role of European institutions. And let's say that, for the last 10 years, we haven't seen a lot of that. Of course, I always, laudator corporis acti. I always compare it to the times of Delors, when there was a strong voice, a strong narrative, which was recognized everywhere in Europe. It was a smaller Europe at the time, but I think you cannot rely mostly on national government to do that. National governments will fight their own interests. The best thing they could do is stop bashing Brussels, and that would already be a big step forward.
We'll get to actually the institutional question later, but I would like to touch on something that populism, what triggered populism, which is, as you rightly said, the crisis. Charles Berly, who got a few votes but actually pointed to a very important point also related to France, he asks, be honest, have you bought the Montebourg's blender? And you might be a little bit surprised by this question, but obviously he refers to the cover story in Le Parisien a while ago, where Industry Minister Arnaud Montebourg was posing with the French flag in the back and a sailor's sweatshirt, wearing a Michel Herbelin watch and holding a Moulinex blender. In a way, and said made in France, and in a way doing a little bit of a clin d'oeil to the Buy America Act that Obama passed a while ago, in the sense that we're going back to protectionism, in a way trying to repatriate manufacturing and demanding that citizens buy local. So
I don't think that's true.
The question, obviously, how do you make the right balance between those protectionism pressure and free trade?
There are protectionist pressures. There have always been protectionist pressures because some people still believe that shooting in your imports is a good way to sustain your employment. Now, we all know this is wrong. It does not work. It never really worked. But assuming it did work a few centuries ago, it won't work today or tomorrow. If you look at world trade today, most of what is traded is parts and components. Mercantilism, which is this old mantra that imports are bad and exports is good, just makes no sense in today's world. And by the way, a Moulinex blender, if you look at what's in there, is not really made in France.
No.
It's made in many parts of this planet. It's assembled in France, which is great because it shows that France can add value to something which is produced elsewhere for its most part. So this is not the right direction. This is not the direction the world is going in. And opening trade works better than closing trade. And especially in this world where things are made in the world. They are produced in very different countries. And if you shoot in your imports today, the immediate consequence is you deteriorate the competitiveness of your exports, hence the value addition of your economy, and the sum of value addition in your economy is your GNP. So shooting in your imports is the best way to shrink your GNP, which is exactly the contrary of what we have to do if we want to reduce unemployment.
We'll get to it, but before I want to, we'll get to trade and TTIP later. Before moving forward, there is a question by Ricardo David Mariani on what is the sector that the EU could take the lead in the global economy. Is there really a sector where you think we can have the leadership? At one point we thought it was renewables, wind and solar, and now we see that actually China has taken almost the lead on solar at least. So is there really a sector that can have a big impact on the European economy?
It's not the question of a sector. It's a question of many sectors because there is no such thing as an economy that is run on one sector. They all interpenetrate each other, whether it's good and whether it's services. If you take a tablet like yours, is it a good? Is it a services? Which sector does it come from? It comes from many sectors. And Europe, for instance, in the 80s, was very strong in mobile telephony because Europe invented at the time the standard for mobile telephony. So there is no guaranteed position. I think Europe should, in the future, target economic activities where you use the most brain juice. This is what we have. We have a lot of that. And by the way, a lot of that is unemployed at present. But we should play on our two comparative advantages. One, the size of the market. Hence, we are better than others in areas where economies of scale matter a lot. Because of our size, we have 500 million reasonably rich consumers, at least as compared to the rest of the world. And second, we should play on our comparative advantage, which is qualification, which is education. I mean, a lot remains to be done. I agree with that, but comparatively to the rest of the world, and notably to the part which is not US, and US clearly remain ahead of us in the digital economy, in the sort of frontier technology, but we are not far from that, and notably in things like hard sciences, for instance.
Precisely on
or
that.
Medicines, where Europe is the number one for medical technology, treatment, and welfare in the world.
Precisely on that. I was wondering, and this is, if I may, I want to jump in, because obviously the EU has done quite a lot in trying to boost new skills and trying to train our manpower so that they can fill those jobs that are still vacant, because there are a lot of highly qualified jobs that are vacant because we don't have, despite our university and our brain power, we still don't have the right people. So what can be done in order to activate quickly and fill those jobs that are vacant?
A lot of that depends on the quality of domestic policies. Education will not be Europeanized. It's a local, national system. The institutions are different. The relationship of people to education is different. But there are areas where if we pool our resources, we will be better together than each of us alone. And research is a good example of that. We know that in biotech, in nanotechnology, in digital economy, investing together leads to much more results. Why are big corporates like Microsoft and Google so successful in inventions? Because they have a huge pot of money, which others do not have, which they can bet on researchers, and it's like a bit like the pharmaceutical industry in the past. They don't all succeed, but if you increase the chances in having many researchers working, one of them will find the golden goose. So this is an area where we have to put more.
But that would mean that also Europeans have to become more risk takers than Americans.
I agree with that.
Americans are.
Depends very much on the countries. It's true that there is a sort of infrastructural problem in Europe, which is that risk capital, private equity is not what it is in the US, because our financial system is much less on the market and much more within the bank's balance sheet. But to put it very simply, let's keep investing in multi-European education programs, in programs like Erasmus, for instance, that allow Europeans to get a check of what's on the other side of the frontier. And let's pull more of what we do, which of course is always difficult, because this is about excellence. If you decide to put a pot of money on biotech in Europe, you cannot have a pot of money for 28 countries. If they see that as a sort of, spreading over the money, it won't work. We have to be tougher in saying, well, this is where they are excellent, they are better here than here, and then, you act consequently.
Okay, so I think I'm going to switch to the institutional questions, because I see that there is quite a lot of buzz on the web. One is asking, wait a minute, I lost it. No, here, how can the institution be more legitimate, basically jumping on what you said earlier, when the member states are mostly attacking the EU, making people forget that the EU is ruled by the member states?
No, I think it's a valid point. We all know that part of the Euroscepticism is fueled by member states when they scapegoat Brussels, which is a very easy thing to do. In any, if you live in the US, bashing Washington is a well-known trick in local politics. It always works. These people up there, down there. Okay. Now, this has to be resisted. If European politicians are serious about building Europe, and most of them are, there are fringes which obviously, for the moment, do not share this view, they have to behave. And if their citizens believe they don't behave, they have a vote. They have a vote. The problem is that this implies that the European dimension of what national politicians do is more taken into account. And this takes you back to this issue of sense of belonging, which, in my view, necessitates a more forceful narrative of why we need to do that for the future.
Rightly so, more of the sense of belonging. In the past, the Franco-German couple, in a way, has pushed for it was the engine of European integration. Right now, we see a little bit of the two countries taking different lead on how we should integrate more. One of the questions from Roger van Kampenhout says, when do you think the Franco-German couple will come up with real concrete initiatives when the two partners will actually use the same words, but above all would give them the same content? Meaning, even if they use the same words, they're actually talking a different language. So this, I suppose, it refers to how we can integrate more or less Europe. When do you think there is this discrepancy?
Well, I mean, if you look at facts, 60 years of European integration, it's pretty obvious that the Franco-German convergence is a crucial factor for European integration. When this engine works, Europe works better than when it doesn't work. And this is for a simple reason, which is these are the two biggest countries, and they probably are the two most different countries. The French and the Germans have different views. They have a different Weltanschauung. They have a different economic and social system in their mind. And if they converge, then this is a big step towards European convergence. Now, we know the terms of the trade-off. French have to become more serious about the economy, and the Germans have to become more serious about foreign policy. French spend part of their time wrangling about how to share the cake without a lot of time wrangling about how to increase the cake, which the Germans are very good at. And the Germans globally believe that if there's no war with Russia and France, that's peace in the world. Well, this is not peace in the world. The world remains a dangerous place in many areas. Globalization may fuel tensions here and there, and if Europe wants to have its weight in the world, Europe needs to care more about the rest of the world. Now, the French care about the rest of the world in many ways.
They proved it in the last year, especially.
And they have a certain tradition in this, which the Germans do not have, and again, for understandable reasons. I can understand, knowing a bit of the European history, why the Germans are not that keen on having German soldiers either killed or killing others in the name of defending the values and interests of Europe. But this will have to happen in the future. So, this basic trade-off, one is more about the economy. The other one is more about values, about society. This trade-off has to happen, and I think the way it happens, it brings the sort of mainstream of European thinking. Again, not because they should rule Europe, but because if they do the job a proper convergence, then it's much easier for the others to join this consensus.
Let me go back a little bit on foreign affairs, and especially on trade foreign affairs with the United States. We are negotiating TTIP right now. I have no time to actually look at all the questions we received, but one of the question is about protecting European values, like you actually underlined, and that is, for example, culture. One of the questions is how to protect the European culture by the invasion of the cultural mass product from the USA in the framework of the TTIP. Right now we have a mandate, and in the mandate we know perfectly well that we succeeded to take away the cultural exception. But is there any other area that you think we should shelter from the mandate? This is the question from Caroline
I think this is a very open question, and if you want to know more about TTIP, go to the Notre Europe Institut Jacques Delors website. We just published a very solid piece, which was the summary of a seminar we had in Brussels at the end of last year. So it's a very complex issue. It's about whether or not we should have some sort of transatlantic internal market. It's not very much about reducing tariffs. There's not much left between Europe and US. It's more about what we call regulatory convergence. And then I think one should understand that this sort of negotiation doesn't raise the same problems as the previous ones. Now, culture, as you know, as per the Treaty of the European Union, is not seen as a normal tradable sector. And this is part of the acquis communautaire. If there are other areas, my guess is that at the end of the day, this convergence, which is about precaution for food, for toys, for cars, for data privacy, and there may be attitudes which are different from both sides of the Atlantic, because precaution is linked to a scale of values. If I'm American, I'll do things until they are forbidden, because they are risky. If I'm a European, I will wait for an authorization to do things because I have to prove it's not risky. So the cultures are different. But at the end of the day, my guess is that if there is convergence, which is the real trade opener for the future in the frame of such a negotiation, the convergence will take place on the higher precautionary level on each side. That's my guess. It won't work for political reasons, as if US have a precautionary standard here and EU there, and they will both have to go down. I think it will align on the highest on both sides. That's my guess, although obviously this negotiation will take a lot of time.
A lot of time. It will definitely not be done by the end of the year, as it was foreseen. Last but not least, because I'm conscious of time, Alessandro Gini asked you, Mr. Lamy, what is your next step? The presidency of the European Commission or Matignon? And if I may jump in, Jacques Delors, with whom you have said to have a father-son relationship, said not so far ago throughout his work, Pascal Lamy has shown that markets need freedom, but regulations as well. That's exactly the German economic model, social market economy. Do you think he was doing a clin d'oeil to Mrs. Merkel by saying
No,
so?
I think,
and what is
Jacques Delors, who's a great friend of mine and which I respect a lot because he taught me most of what I know in politics, just forgot that I'm 66 years old. And you don't behave when you're 66 the way you behave when you're 36 or 46. So at my age, it's not reasonable to pitch for high responsibilities. Now, I have one passion. I have a few passions. Music is one. Classical music is one. Europe is another one. So sometimes passion can trump reasons, but in the world of politics, this is decided by elections. We have elections in the European Parliament next May. My political family has a candidate, who is Martin Schulz. Then there is a process as per the European Constitution that the European Council nominates a candidate taking into account the results of the elections.
Correct.
And then we will see. But for the moment, I'm fighting with and behind the leader of my camp.
Okay, but there are rumors saying that, you know, those candidates might not be the one that actually ultimately will be selected by the member states and by European leaders.
Yeah, but you know, being old has a few disadvantages, but it also has one advantage, is that you care much less about rumors.
Okay. Last question, because obviously I'm curious. At the Barroso, at the last EU-Russia summit this week, actually cited Dostoevsky, who wrote, "Much unhappiness has come into the world because of bewilderment and things left unsaid." Do you think something, we hear a lot about Europe right now, do you think something has been not said yet that you would like to say?
No, I think I've always seen in the future Russia and Europe in the same bed, the same civilization, the same space in many ways, although a very different political, historical tradition. So the question is not whether one day this will happen. I think it will happen one day. But whether it's 200 years from now or 20 years from now, I'm not sure. And since I started realizing this, the horizon of convergence has been moving forward permanently. What I thought 10 years ago would take 10 years, I think now will take 20 years. And I don't think this is good news.
But I actually didn't mean for EU-Russia. He said it in the context of EU-Russia. But my question to you is, there is something that hasn't been said yet about Europe that we should actually say?
I think, I mean, I wouldn't take it in the sort of Dostoevsky sort of sense. Dostoevsky was a very sort of, sort of specialist in human psychology. But I think what is still unclear to most Europeans, whereas this is pretty clear to most non-Europeans, is what Europe is about.
And on that, we will end this third web dialogue. Thank you.